Welcome back. Just in case you're just joining us, you're watching Today's Business with me, David Obabudike. Finally, the federal government has signed the 30,000 naira minimum wage. However, the news going around is that there is plan by government to increase VAT in order to fund these minimum wage, though government had come to deny that allegation, or rather that rumor. Today, we shall be looking at possible ways government can fund the minimum wage, because we also understand that it sure does come with some level of pressure on government's revenue. I have with me in the studio this day, I have Moses Umoru, who is the DG, Franco-Nigerian Chamber of Commerce. Moses, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. Great to be here today.
Yes, it was good news when we all heard that finally the minimum wage has come to stay. How did that hit you for the start?
We are considering that already, looking at that from our economic team. But am I going to say that's good news? I might not necessarily want to say that, because instead of increasing the wage bill of the civil service, you can look at increasing efficiency of the civil service. Well, that's a discussion. That's a different angle totally. But yes, talking about the minimum wage, it's a good one for civil servants. But we need to understand that this amount of money goes not just for the lower cadres, it goes straight up even to level 14 and the rest. It goes across board and all of that. So that's a huge chunk for the federal government. And one thing we have discovered that it was not actually captured in the 2019 budget. So somehow, the federal government will have to look for other ways of financing this huge minimum wage. Currently, the recurrent expenditure is over 4.04 trillion naira, which is close to 50% of our current budget. Yes. And if you look at Nigeria debt servicing to revenue ratio, it's 60% already. So for every 100 naira Nigerian make, 60 naira is used to service our debt. Okay. So where is this money going to come from? So one advice I'm going to give the federal government is this: is simple. Let's look at the exclusive list. That's one area we can be able to fund these things from. Let state governments handle minerals and mining from their various states. One thing we have discovered over time is that states don't generate their own revenues. They go cap in hand to Abuja every month to get allocation. Let the state be independent, because it's not just about the federal government at the end of the day. It's about the state financing these amounts of money. So let's look at the exclusive list. Let's remove that from the federal government responsibility, take that to the states so the states can become independent. That's one way I see that they can be able to finance this. Or else we are still going to go back to the debts again and look at our debt to revenue ratio.
We don't have a window to borrow.
We don't have a window to borrow anymore. Even though they call debt to GDP, no. If you don't, we don't consider debt to GDP. We look at debt servicing to revenue. How much do you service your debt based on the amount you're making on a daily?
There was rumor about increase in VAT.
Yes.
Does this is this a possible way of increasing government's revenue?
I do not see it as a rumor. I see it as something that is coming up in the pipeline. It's just basically it's on the grapevine currently, but I'm sure in the next 1 or 2 months you will see that these things will come into implementation. That's one area the government is looking at, because there is no budget allocation for such amounts of money. Another thing they are going to look at is to broaden the tax net. When you broaden the tax net, especially you focus on the informal sector, there has to be somehow an enactment that ensures that we bring in the informal sector into the tax, because huge amount of monies goes into the informal sector, and these are not captured because they are not registered companies and all of that. If they can provide something around that for them to ensure that the informal sector is captured inside the tax net, we can have a lot of revenues from there. But I think the only thing I would see that is possible right now is, number one, allowing the states to be independent, and number two, broaden the tax net to ensure that more firms come in and more firms are paying taxes.
The cost of running government, which a lot of people had complained over the years. We know how much goes down in the Senate, how much goes down with running federal let me say the executive arm of government. Isn't there a need that this should be tinkered with? We need to start learning how to save money, saving costs at this point in time.
Like I said before, we have an over-bloated civil service, of functions that are overlapping functions in the civil service. We have to look at that. And because it's already enacted in the law currently, it's difficult for us to make those adjustments. That is where, if the restructuring agenda comes on board, a lot of things will have to go down. Even the cost of civil services, even in terms of efficiency, in terms of productivity of the civil service, you can see how poor these people are performing. So it's not just necessarily about, okay, now we have increased the minimum wage. Are we saying that it's going to also increase productivity productivity? The answer is almost a no. So we need to look at efficiency. We need to ensure that we restructure our civil service and bring it down a little bit. 4.4 trillion is too much. It's too much for recurrent expenditure. It's too much. I think so. That's what I think.
Well, I don't know. I think I was in a conversation with a few experts a couple of days back, and the argument was around the fact that we have quite a number of government assets that should be let off, that could generate quite a huge sum of money for government. Would you agree with the fact that, I'll give you an instance, you drive all the way from Obalende to heading towards, what do you call that place now, where you have the immigration office,
yes.
And then you see this old secretariat building.
Exactly.
And every time I drive past there, what comes to mind is, this could pass for a 5-star hotel.
Of course.
With a few millions pumped in there, we have a 5-star hotel standing.
Of course.
Structures like this, like that rather, these are government establishments. Wouldn't you think that this could be a means of revenue generation for the government?
Of course, and the thing is this, government cannot manage assets that will generate revenue in any private sector driven economy. You know, in any private sector driven economy, government hands off. All you provide is the enabling environment and allow the businesses to thrive within your enabling environment. So government having assets, so much of assets, even talking of the airports, let's not go into the airports, even going to NNPC, for example, the government needs to hands off. Government has no business actually doing business. You understand? That is why we have these assets that are not producing anything and they are wasting. We're talking of an area like Ikoyi, for example. That's a lot of money wasting on the daily, the rest of them. So government needs to sell off most of these assets and hand over. There has to be a concession policy that will ensure that these assets are taken over to the private. See, an economy that must grow must be private sector driven with good regulations. Very important, because private sector could take advantage of assets and the rest of them. Proper regulations driven by the private sector is fundamental for growth in any economy. Very, very important. Very important.
Well, there are also talks about the fact that this minimum wage could trigger up a rise in inflation. Do you agree with that?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily?
Not necessarily.
You think it's minimal?
It's minimal. It's minimal. It's minimal. Looking at it, it's minimal. It will not trigger inflation. It will not. I don't think so.
Let's look at the composition of the civil service. Civil service cuts across both the federal and the states. And,
yes.
Do they make 50% of the workforce?
I do not really think so.
Okay.
I do not really think so. If you look at the civil service currently, you look at the ministries, governments, parastatals and all of that, they do not make 50% of the workforce. And most especially in terms of productivity, I would not just talk about numbers. It's not based on the principle of numbers. It's based on the principle of output, in terms of, what they are doing. Most of us, we visit some government parastatals and we see even the attitude of, civil servants, even when they respond to you and all of that. I don't want to mention parastatals here. It's appalling. We need to focus more on increasing efficiency, increasing productivity, as against numbers. Numbers does not, majority of times, doesn't even bring about the results we need most of the times in an economy.
Anyways, well, very well said. Let's really hope that government will take all we've said so far a bit more seriously and be able to generate more revenue away from increasing, or rather putting more pressure on the people, and also ensuring that it starts thinking outside the box. It's extremely very important, and also that maybe the whole clamor for some level of restructuring should take the front burner in very recent days. Very important. Before you go, let me ask your take on the NPRO, 50 basis point reduction in NPRO. How does this hit you as a private sector operator?
Not very significant. Let me take us a little bit of history. If you look at one thing I must actually commend as far as these elections this year is concerned. If you look at every election cycle, 4 years, you discover that after elections, there's always an increase in the NPR rate. Why? Because it's a CBN policy to mop out money that
liquidity.
So this time around, we discovered that there were no much election spending. Well, we can say that's a good one. It's a positive one. We can't say that affected the whole election process. Anyway, that's a different discussion entirely. But reducing the NPR by 50 basis points is positive for the books, but it's not positive in reality. Commercial banks are not actually lending to the real sector. commercial banks are not lending to the private sector. So it's not just about, because Gordon Emefiele mentioned it, the CBN governor mentioned it clearly. He said the reason behind the reduction by 50 basis points to ensure that we have lower cost of acquiring loans from the commercial banks. But the question now is, are the commercial banks actually giving out these loans? You know, commercial banking in Nigeria has become a business per day. What do I mean? I mean that they take these funds and invest in treasury bills, and that gets between 16 to 18%. So the federal government is actually giving monies to the commercial banks to do their business. If you look at their results, most of them is interest earnings from treasury bills of federal government is huge for them. You know, so if they see that they can get these monies from treasury bills, they will not give out the same monies to the real sector. So the federal government policy of lending is even stifling the real sector indirectly at the end of the day. So I think what the CBN should do is to not just look at the MPRO, they should look at the cash reserve ratio of banks, 22.5%. Okay, bring it down to 20%. And stipulate by a policy or by law that 2% of that should be given out to the private sector. And then there has to be a means to monitor these things. Moral suasion is just talk, okay, we appeal that you give these things out. No, let there be a policy. 2% out of these monies should be given out to the real sector, and then we can see growth. That is what they want, but right now it's just for the books. It's not. In reality, it's not. But
it's a good signal to where the CBN wants to trend.
Yes, of course, it's a good signal. It's a good signal. It looks good. That's why I say it looks good on paper. On paper, it looks good. For foreign analysts, it looks good. But in reality, it's not very. We know if you walk into the bank, for example, they won't give you loans. Definitely, no. They won't.
So we don't. So we're not expecting so much as impacting the real sector, not even the stock market or investors' confidence.
No, not at all. There has to be policy. You know, when you back up this action with a particular policy, it helps. It helps to ensure that there is compliance. Yeah. So that's why I said, okay, let's focus on CRR, cash reserve ratio, as against the MPRO. I think it's better.
Some people would also argue that yes, there is no proper alignment between fiscal and monetary policies, which obviously makes a nonsense of this whole reduction in basis point.
Of course. No, the Nigerian economy, if you can't use basic economics to analyze the Nigerian economy. It's a bit different. It's a bit different. Now, I'll give an example. If you look at this year's budget, when the budget was passed, normally governments are the government is the highest spenders and is an injection into the circular flow of income. Yes. Normally, when the budget is passed and there is funds into the system, there should be inflation, right? Yeah. But this time around, do you observe that in Nigeria, you don't experience that? Why? Because there is no inclusive growth. So funds don't flow all inclusive. So for example, now the policy of the federal government doesn't necessarily affect the common man. Why? The common man, after all, provides his own light, provides his own water, most of the times provides his own road. So the common man is already having a government, is building his own economy independent of the federal government. So most of the times, that's why you can see that there is always a dissonance between the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. It can't work because it doesn't affect the common man at the end of the day. It's not possible. That's the way it is.
Well, Umoru, there's still so very much to talk about, but unfortunately we are running out of time. Thank you for coming on the show.
I really
appreciate this. Thank you very much. And that was Moses Umoru, DG, Franco-Nigerian Chamber of Commerce. The conversation was about monetary policy alignment with fiscal policy, minimum wage, and ways of funding. I think that's about how far we can take on the show today. Thanks for watching. Till I come your way again next week, do have yourself a profitable business day.